What if the clearest sign that you have genuinely transformed psychologically is that you feel absolutely nothing when you think about the people who once defined your entire emotional world? Carl Jung observed something profoundly unsettling in his clinical work, something that directly contradicts everything the modern wellness industry wants to sell you about empathic awakening. He documented cases of individuals who had severed contact with family members, close friends, or entire social circles. And instead of experiencing the guilt, grief, or moral torment that mainstream therapeutic frameworks predicted, these individuals reported feeling an almost startling sense of clarity, not relief in the conventional sense, not the temporary exhale of someone escaping a bad situation, but a deep structural stillness that Jung recognized as something categorically different from emotional numbness or avoidance. This is the central paradox we are going to explore today, because that feeling of clarity, that absence of guilt where guilt should theoretically live, is not a warning sign of psychopathy or dissociation. According to Jung's decades of research into consciousness and psychological individuation, it may actually be one of the most reliable indicators of genuine transformation. Jung spent the better part of his career documenting how human beings grow, and his findings repeatedly contradicted the mainstream therapeutic narrative that healthy development always moves toward greater social integration, greater family harmony, and greater emotional accessibility. What he actually found was far more complicated and far less comfortable. This video is not about the empathic awakening being sold to you through meditation apps, crystal subscriptions, and weekend retreats. That version has been thoroughly commercialized, romanticized, and stripped of every psychologically meaningful element it once contained. What we are examining here is the actual clinical phenomenon that Jung identified, the real psychological architecture of what happens when a genuinely empathic person undergoes authentic transformation, and why that process looks almost nothing like what the wellness industry has conditioned you to expect. Jung was extraordinarily precise about where this sensitivity actually comes from, and his answer is going to disturb anyone who has built their identity around the idea that they were simply born more spiritually attuned than other people. The clinical reality that Jung documented is considerably less romantic and considerably more important. Children who grow up in volatile, unpredictable, or emotionally dangerous households develop an almost superhuman capacity to read the emotional atmosphere of a room because they had to, not because the universe selected them for a special purpose, not because they carried ancient wisdom from previous lifetimes, but because reading a parent's mood accurately and quickly had real, immediate, physical, and emotional consequences. A child who could detect the subtle shift in their mother's posture before an emotional explosion, or who learned to interpret their father's silence as either safe or dangerous, was a child who had developed a genuine survival technology. Jung's wounded healer archetype speaks directly to this developmental reality. He recognized that the individuals who became most extraordinarily attuned to the suffering and emotional states of others were almost universally people whose own emotional needs had been chronically neglected, dismissed, or actively punished in childhood, because their internal emotional world was either unsafe to inhabit or consistently invalidated by the people around them. They redirected the entirety of their perceptual energy outward. They became specialists in other people's inner lives, precisely because their own inner life had never been granted the space or safety to develop freely. This sensitivity was never a gift bestowed by the universe. It was forged through necessity, shaped by repetition, and reinforced because it worked. It became the currency through which a child purchased safety, approval, and moments of genuine connection in an environment that offered very little of either. Jung's framework demands that we honor the intelligence of this adaptation, while simultaneously recognizing the profound psychological cost it extracted from the person who developed it. Jung had a specific term for what happens when the psyche takes genuine pain and wraps it in a narrative of superiority, and he considered it one of the most sophisticated and therefore most dangerous defense mechanisms the human mind can construct. The wellness industry has built an extraordinarily profitable architecture around precisely this mechanism. When someone tells you that you feel everything so deeply because you are a light worker, an old soul, or a chosen empath navigating a world of less evolved souls, they are not offering you spiritual wisdom. They are offering your wounded psyche exactly what it has always desperately wanted: a story that transforms the shame of having been neglected, overlooked, or chronically invalidated into a mark of distinction. The child, who was never truly seen by their parents, becomes the ancient soul too profound for ordinary human understanding. The person whose boundaries were systematically violated becomes the selfless healer chosen to absorb collective suffering. Jung would identify this narrative transformation not as awakening, but as the psyche's most elegant method of avoiding the one process that could actually produce genuine change, which is the direct interrogation of the original wound itself. His warning about what he called inflation, the ego's expansion through identification with archetypal or grandiose narratives, was essentially a warning about this exact phenomenon dressed in contemporary spiritual language. The structure of trauma remains completely intact underneath the spiritual reframing. The patterns continue, the relationships repeat, the exhaustion deepens, But now the suffering feels noble rather than simply painful. And feeling noble about your pain is not healing. It is the most comfortable possible way to remain exactly where you are. Real psychological transformation, the kind Jung documented through decades of clinical observation, requires something far less seductive than a chosen one narrative. It requires sitting with the genuinely uncomfortable question of whether the sensitivity you have spiritualized was actually a wound that deserves examination rather than a gift that deserves celebration. The actual beginning of empathic awakening, according to Jung's framework, has nothing to do with crystals, energy fields, or the discovery that you are more spiritually evolved than the people who have hurt you. It begins with a specific category of psychological question that is considerably less comfortable than anything the wellness industry will ever encourage you to ask. The first question is deceptively simple. Why do you feel personally responsible for the emotional states of people around you? Not spiritually responsible, not cosmically called to help, but viscerally, physically, almost involuntarily responsible in a way that makes other people's discomfort feel like your own emergency. The second question follows immediately. When exactly did you learn that your value as a person was directly proportional to your capacity to absorb, manage, and resolve the emotional distress of others? These questions do not lead toward light or expansion or any of the luminous destinations promised by spiritual awakening narratives. They lead directly downward into the specific darkness of your own psychological history, and what they illuminate there is genuinely devastating. Jung documented this period extensively because his patients consistently described something that clinically resembled severe depression but was structurally different. It was the disillusionment that arrives when you begin seeing the actual mechanics of your closest relationships with complete clarity for the first time. You start recognizing the precise choreography of dynamics you have been performing for decades. The reliable one, the forgiving one, the one who never needs anything, the one who absorbs tension so that everyone else can remain comfortable. And then comes the recognition that Jung considered the most psychologically significant moment in the entire awakening process. That performance was never love. It was never compassion or generosity or spiritual sensitivity. It was a trauma response so deeply embedded in your personality structure that you had spent your entire adult life mistaking it for your most admirable qualities, which means the identity you built around being caring was itself constructed on unexamined pain. Jung documented a specific psychological crisis that he observed recurring with remarkable consistency among individuals whose entire identity had been constructed around the helper role. And he described it as one of the most destabilizing experiences the human psyche can undergo. The crisis arrives at the precise moment when the empath begins questioning whether the helping itself has ever actually helped anyone. Because here is the structural problem that Jung identified with unflinching clinical precision. If being the helper, the absorber, the endlessly available emotional resource for everyone around you has become the totality of who you are, then questioning the value or authenticity of that role is not a philosophical exercise. It is experienced by the psyche as complete self-annihilation. You cannot examine the helper without threatening the entire architecture of the self that was built around helping. Jung's research revealed something even more disturbing about the actual mechanics of emotional absorption. The empathic person who takes on the emotional pain of others does not transform that pain. They do not alchemize it or heal it or release it back into the universe in some purified form. They simply relocate it, transferring it from the other person's nervous system directly into their own, where it accumulates across years and decades and eventually manifests as chronic fatigue that no amount of sleep resolves, mysterious physical illnesses that confound medical professionals, and a depression that arrives without any identifiable external cause, because its cause is entirely internal and entirely historical. This is where Jung's concept of shadow integration becomes absolutely essential for understanding the empath's situation. The shadow of the helper, the part that remains completely unexamined and therefore completely in control, is not cruelty or selfishness or any of the qualities the helper consciously fears. It is the need to be needed. It is the profound terror of existing without someone to save. And the spiritual gift narrative, the idea that absorption is your divine purpose, keeps the door of that particular cage not just closed, but locked from the inside. The first transformation that emerges from the death of the helper is so dramatic in its external presentation that almost everyone in the awakening empath's life will misread it as damage. People who previously had unlimited access to your emotional energy, your time, your patience, and your capacity for forgiveness will experience your transformation as coldness, as walls going up, as bitterness following some unnamed wound. Jung was precise about why this misreading is almost universal and almost inevitable. What is actually happening has nothing to do with damage or defensiveness or the construction of protective barriers. What is happening is the emergence of genuine psychological sovereignty for what may be the very first time in the person's life. The old empath operated from a position of essentially infinite availability. There was always more patience, always another conversation, always the capacity to show up for people regardless of whether those people had ever genuinely shown up in return. The awakened empath becomes almost startlingly selective, not because they have stopped caring about human connection, but because they have finally understood that their energy is finite and that finite resources require discernment rather than indiscriminate distribution. Jung identified the core cognitive shift underlying this transformation as the moment the empath stops confusing self-sacrifice with love. Real love, the kind Jung observed in psychologically healthy relationships, requires mutual recognition between two complete people who are each showing up authentically, rather than one person performing an endless service role for another person's comfort and convenience. Self-sacrifice is not love. It is a transaction conducted under the belief that your authentic self is insufficient to be loved as it actually is. This transformation ends relationships, and it ends them by design rather than by accident. The awakened empath begins recognizing with uncomfortable clarity that their energy was being treated as an infinite resource by people who had never done the psychological work required to earn genuine access to it. And that recognition makes continuation of those relationships structurally impossible. One of the most psychologically significant capabilities that emerges in the awakened empath is something that looks almost nothing like what most people associate with empathic development. It is the capacity to let tension exist in a room without immediately moving to dissolve it. The previously unawakened empath experienced unresolved tension as a physical emergency, something that activated every survival mechanism in their nervous system and demanded immediate intervention, regardless of whether that intervention was actually appropriate or helpful. Jung was clear about what that compulsion actually represents: the desperate need to smooth everything over, to soften every hard truth, to ensure that everyone in proximity remains comfortable, is not kindness. It is a trauma response wearing the costume of compassion. Jung's analysis of what he called the aggressive shadow is essential here, and almost entirely absent from wellness industry conversations about empathic development. Empaths who have repressed every expression of aggression, confrontation, or fierce boundary setting throughout their lives are not peaceful people. They are domesticated people, which is an entirely different psychological condition. Genuine peace is chosen. Domestication is conditioned through repeated punishment of authentic responses. When the awakened empath integrates their aggressive shadow, they do not become cruel or combative. They develop the capacity for conscious choice between gentleness and strength, rather than having gentleness be their only available response, regardless of what the situation actually requires. The transformation of perception that Jung documented in genuinely awakened empaths is perhaps the most subtle and most profound shift of all. They retain the full sensitivity, the complete capacity to perceive and understand the suffering of others with extraordinary depth and accuracy. But they have severed the automatic neural pathway that previously connected perception of suffering to personal responsibility for its resolution. They can now sit with someone in genuine pain, understand that pain completely, and simultaneously recognize that rescuing that person from their necessary experience would be a disservice rather than an act of love. This is empathy matured beyond codependence into something actually useful. The unawakened empath lives in a particular kind of psychological terror that rarely gets named accurately. It is the terror of being misunderstood, of having their intentions questioned, of existing in someone else's perception as something other than what they believe themselves to be. This terror produces an exhausting behavioral pattern that Jung observed consistently: the endless self-explanation, the compulsive clarification, the hours spent crafting messages designed to ensure that the other person understands exactly what was meant and exactly how much care was intended. The awakened empath develops a capability that is deceptively simple to describe and extraordinarily difficult to actually achieve. They learn to state a truth once, clearly, and without performance, and then tolerate whatever interpretation the other person constructs around that truth, without chasing understanding or collapsing under misrepresentation. This is not indifference. It is the psychological security of someone who no longer requires external validation to maintain their sense of reality. What makes the awakened empath genuinely threatening to dysfunctional systems is the specific combination of two capabilities that rarely exist together. The first is perceptual accuracy, the ability to identify manipulation, recognize narcissistic behavioral patterns, and detect the precise mismatches between what people say and what their energy actually communicates. The second is willingness to act on that perception rather than suppressing it to maintain relational comfort. Either capability alone is manageable for a dysfunctional family or organization. Both together are not. Jung observed that unhealthy systems, whether families, institutions, or organizations, depend absolutely on the participation of perceptive people who have been conditioned to doubt their own perceptions. The awakened empath has stopped doubting. They either name what they see with complete clarity, which exposes the agreed upon blindness that the entire system depends on for its continuation, or they remove themselves entirely, which withdraws the empathic labor that was quietly holding the dysfunctional structure together. Both responses make them someone the system cannot afford to have present, which is precisely why their transformation is so frequently pathologized by the people around them. Nobody in the wellness industry will sell you what Jung actually documented about the experiential reality of genuine empathic transformation because it does not make a compelling retreat package or an inspiring social media caption. The raw psychological truth is that the period following the death of the helper identity is among the most painful experiences Jung observed in his entire clinical career, and he observed a considerable range of human suffering. The old empath had social abundance, but it was role-based abundance. There were always people who needed you, always someone calling, always a crisis requiring your particular brand of emotional labor. Your calendar was full because you were useful, because you were available, because you had made yourself indispensable to people who had never actually chosen you as a full human being, but had chosen the function you performed. When that role dies, the abundance disappears with it, and what replaces it has an almost exile-like quality that no spiritual framework adequately prepares you for. Saturday nights alone, after decades of constant connection, silence, where there was previously always someone needing something, the particular loneliness of having chosen authenticity and discovered that authenticity has a significantly smaller audience than performance did. Jung described the transition period between the collapse of the old identity and the stabilization of the new one as a genuine psychological wilderness, a disorienting in-between space where the old self is no longer operational and the new self is not yet fully formed. You grieve relationships that you simultaneously recognize were never genuinely reciprocal. You grieve a version of love that you now understand was actually trauma bonding dressed in the language of deep connection. You grieve the identity itself, the helper, the healer, the one who could always be counted on, because even a painful identity is still an identity, and its absence creates a terrifying formlessness. Jung was deeply critical of any framework that skipped this grief, because skipping it means the transformation never actually happened. Jung's concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming the most complete and authentic version of oneself, finds one of its most striking expressions in what he observed in empaths who had survived the full psychological transformation. He called the endpoint the individuated empath, and it looks almost nothing like either the exhausted helper who began the journey or the luminous spiritual being promised by the wellness industry at its conclusion. The individuated empath has completed a specific series of psychological movements that Jung considered among the most demanding available to human consciousness. They have moved from unconscious sensitivity, the kind that happens to you, that pulls you into other people's emotional fields without your consent or awareness, to conscious perception, the kind you deploy deliberately and can withdraw intentionally. They have moved from compulsive absorption, the automatic taking on of others' pain as a survival reflex to deliberate choice about when and how and whether to engage with the suffering they perceive. They have moved from performing empathy as a strategy for survival and belonging to embodying it as an expression of genuine psychological strength. The power that emerges from this transformation has a quality that Jung found remarkable precisely because of its resilience. It cannot be taken away through withdrawal of approval, through social exclusion, through being misunderstood or misrepresented, because it does not depend on any of those external conditions for its existence. It was forged in the complete absence of external validation, which means external validation can neither create it nor destroy it. The sensitivity itself remains completely intact in the individuated empath. And this is the detail that most contradicts the fear that transformation means losing the capacity for deep connection. The sensitivity does not disappear. It is simply no longer in charge. It informs choices rather than dictating behavior. It provides extraordinarily accurate information about people and situations without generating the compulsive obligation to respond that previously made it a source of chronic depletion. Boundaries are understood not as cold walls erected against intimacy, but as the precise architectural expression of self-respect. What Jung documented across decades of clinical observation about empathic transformation can be distilled into a single insight that the wellness industry will never voluntarily offer you because it cannot be packaged or sold in any form that generates comfortable consumption. Empathic awakening is not a prettier, more spiritual, more luminous version of the person you were before. It is a completely different relationship with yourself, one where sensitivity is a tool you wield rather than a wound that controls you, where perception is a conscious choice rather than an involuntary reflex, and where love is something you offer from genuine fullness rather than something you perform from chronic depletion and unexamined fear. If you are currently living in that terrifying space between identities, where the old self has collapsed and the new one is not yet fully formed, where the loneliness feels enormous and the grief feels disproportionate, and you are quietly wondering whether something has gone fundamentally wrong with you, Jung's clinical observation across hundreds of such transformations offers something more valuable than reassurance. It offers accurate description. The loneliness is not failure. The grief is not weakness or regression. The discomfort is not evidence that you have taken a wrong turn somewhere in your psychological development. It is evidence that something genuinely real is happening, that you are undergoing actual transformation rather than the comfortable performance of transformation that the spiritual marketplace sells as a substitute for the real thing. You are exactly where the process requires you to be. And the difficulty is not incidental to the transformation. It is the transformation. If this exploration of Jung's framework resonated with something you are living or have lived through, we would genuinely value hearing which part of this transformation spoke most directly to your experience in the comments below. Please share this video with someone who needs this particular framework right now. Subscribe for continued exploration of Jung's psychological insights and explore our related videos on shadow integration and individuation that go even deeper into these essential concepts.